Hi, I'm Terry Waltz, and I'd like to talk a little bit today about circling. Circling is a very useful technique for asking unpredictable but repetitive questions. This allows students to hear more comprehensible input during a lesson. The technique of circling originated in TPRS, but it can be used very effectively in any language teaching situation, no matter what method you might be using. I'm going to demonstrate how you can learn to circle using the CircleUp card deck, which is what I use to train teachers in this technique in my workshops. When we circle, we want to ask questions about every part of a sentence. So, for convenience, we'll color each part a different color in our mind. Those colors will correspond to the colors of the circling cards. The color of the card and the directions written on the card will tell us what question we should ask. After practicing with these cards for a time, you won't need to use them anymore. You'll have internalized the skill of asking all sorts of questions in a totally random order, naturally and easily. Here's just a quick example to show that where those colors go really doesn't matter. In Japanese, if we stay with the red, yellow, blue order of colors from left to right, blue is going to end up being the verb, not the object of the sentence, as it is in English. And in Hawaiian, the blue part of the sentence is part verb and part object in this case. Language is messy. Don't get stuck thinking too much about grammar. Just split that sentence up and replace the colored parts as the cards tell you, and you'll get the hang of it soon. So let's look at our first circling card. This is a red yes card. That means we need to ask a question that is answered yes. And to do that, we can only change or focus on the information in the red part of our original sentence. Actually, to ask a yes question, we don't have to change any of the information in the original sentence. We may have to add some words, like does in this example, depending on the language. That's okay. We are concentrating on the meaning, not the exact words. We just want the answer to be yes. So, for this example, our red yes question would be, does Bob want to buy the noodles? How about the no card? To ask a question that's answered no, we'll need to think of an alternative that will be, well, wrong. We want the answer to our question to be no, so that students can hear the correct negative forms of the language. So, in our original sentence, we have Bob as the person doing something, the red part of the sentence in this case. But we need to think of another person, animal, thing, or whatever who could replace Bob. We want to be able to ask a question that will be answered no, or later to give a choice of Bob or someone or something else. We can think of this alternative, like the word George, as a shadow. The shadow always follows the red part, Bob, around, and it never does anything to any other part of the sentence. So, to make our no question, we let our shadow completely replace the original red part. Then, we ask a question using what we get. We may have to adjust the word order a little bit to ask the question naturally. That's okay. So our no question is, does George want to buy noodles? No, he doesn't. Bob wants to buy noodles. To ask an or question giving a choice, we need to have a choice to give the student. So, again, we need to have an alternative in mind. I'm demonstrating this with a single shadow alternative here, but in real life it's better to think of a few of these alternatives before class, because sometimes it's hard to do that when you're actually teaching. So, originally we have Bob as the person doing something. We need to think once more of another personal, animal, thing, or whatever who could replace Bob in that red box of the sentence. We want to ask a question that gives a choice. We'll go ahead and use George again. So, to make our or question, we use that shadow, but we use it as a choice. It doesn't replace the original red part. They are both in the question. But now we have two choices so that we can give an alternative. Does Bob or George want to buy noodles? This can be very unnatural in some languages, so use your judgment. If it sounds weird to you in your target language, just skip using the or questions. The cards with 3 question marks on them represent what we often call WH questions in English. That means questions that are made using question words like who, what, where, and so on. How would we ask a question using a question word and focusing on the red portion of our original sentence? Well, we need to look at the red part and think which question word we would use to ask about it. In this case, since the red part is a person, the correct shadow question word would be who in English. The question word replaces the original red part of the sentence entirely. Then, we may have to adjust the wording of the question a little bit, depending on the language. If you have to adjust, again, that's fine. Just keep your question natural in your target language. Asking these questions is really about the meaning, not about specific grammar or special words. So the question we would get with the WH question is, who wants to buy noodles? Okay, we've asked all the questions we can ask about the red part of the sentence. How about the other parts? Let's take a look at the blue cards, so we can ask questions focusing on the blue part of the sentence. Looking back at our sentence, we see the blue part is noodles. However, all of the yes questions are exactly the same, unless your language can emphasize one part or the other of the sentence. That is possible in English. We could say, does Bob want to buy noodles? Or, does Bob want to buy noodles? But you may not want to do that right away for beginners, even if it is possible. Remember, we're teaching meaning, and we probably wouldn't teach special emphatic expressions right at the beginning. We want them to just get the basics. But we would use these expressions or intonation patterns with more advanced students. If you teach a language that has more than one commonly used way to ask a simple, neutral yes or no question, you should make sure that you use all those different ways to ask the yes questions. Chinese is a good example. We could ask a question by repeating the verb with a bu in between. Bob 想不想买面条? Or we could just add a ma to the end of the sentence. Bob 想买面条吗? Those two questions are essentially the same question, just means, does Bob want to buy noodles? So we want to make sure students get to hear both of them. In English, our question would simply be, does Bob want to buy noodles? And again, that question formulation is the same for all of the different colors of the yes cards. All right, how about a blue no card? Once again, we're going to need to think of an alternative or a shadow that will be wrong so that the answer to our question can be no. We're looking for a shadow for noodles. What could we use to replace it temporarily, just to give a wrong alternative? How about a car? We completely replace the original blue part of our sentence with the new shadow, and we form the correct natural question that we get. Does Bob want to buy a car? I'll bet you know how the blue or card works now, but let's do it just to make sure. Again, we're going to use the same shadow part, a car. But remember, we can't totally replace the original blue part because the question we want to ask will be or, giving choices. So we'll just use our shadow as an alternative. Does Bob want noodles or a car? Should be, does Bob want to buy noodles or a car? The WH question works the same way. We have our shadows. In this case, since the blue part is noodles, The correct question word in English would, of course, be what. But if you begin circling more complicated sentences, as you will with more advanced learners, it might end up being a phrase that's more complicated, like at noon or with his best friend. So, the question word you choose will obviously be different. If your blue section was at noon, you would need to ask when. And for with his best friend, you would need to use with whom. Or with who. I'm not making any judgments on that one. The question word may sound awkward or ungrammatical if it's put right into the blue part of the sentence. Asking, Bob wants to buy what, is not really common, although we might ask it for confirmation or in disbelief. So, to ask the ordinary neutral question, we will adjust our word order to make it a natural one in our target language. What does Bob want to buy? The yellow part of this particular sentence in English may be just a little bit more challenging. This is a pretty simple sentence. In many languages, at the early levels, the red and blue parts end up being the subject and the object. But that's not always true, right, Japanese teachers? Anyway, for this sentence in English, the yellow part there might be just a little bit more challenging than the others to circle. Let's see how to ask the circling questions for this part of our example sentence. We're going to need to come up with a shadow or alternative for that yellow part, which in this case is the verb phrase. There are many choices. In fact, when you're circling in class, you will probably not use only one shadow during a class. The more different wrong choices you give, the more opportunities you have to repeat the language and get it into your students' ears. But we work with only one shadow per circling question. We never change more than one colored part of the sentence at a time. Let's look at that sentence again. Pick any one of our yellow shadows and substitute it into the yellow part of the sentence. Then make our question. Remember, this is the no question. Does Bob want to eat noodles? No. I think that's a pretty sensible question. You could also, however, use shadows that are silly or even impossible. It's all part of the game in TPRS to keep students listening and engaged. They don't want to miss a chance to learn how to say cool things. So your shadows could be words on your curriculum, or words your kids will just like, or words they already know. It's your choice, and you don't have to stick with just one shadow in a class. You will want to use multiple shadows within a single class for all parts of that sentence. But no matter which one or how many you use, the way you ask these questions is the same. Does Bob want to throw noodles? I hope the answer to that's no. Now, how would you ask an or question about that yellow part of the sentence, the verb phrase? Just like with the other parts of the sentence, the or question is easy. Just offer that shadow as an alternative. Does Bob want to eat noodles or throw noodles? I'm sorry, it should be buy noodles. I can't even read my own slides. Okay, here's the tricky part. How do we ask a question about the yellow part using a question word? Remember, we're looking for something to replace wants to buy. For a WH question involving the verb, it's often really hard to ask a question using a question word. Sometimes, if it's an active verb like eats or goes, you could ask, what is Bob doing? But for things like wanting and thinking, it usually isn't that simple. And if you go into a class full of kids and ask, what are Bob's intentions with regard to noodles? That's not only complicated language, it's also a potential riot. So, if this kind of question doesn't come naturally in your language, just skip it. In circling, it's not important that you ask every single last question for every sentence. In fact, that gets boring. What's important is that you get good repetitions of the language while not letting your students anticipate what the answers to these questions are. You can circle all kinds of sentences, much more complicated than just this simple example we've just done. The full CircleUp deck comes with question cards in 4 colors, so you can work with more parts of a sentence at a time. Circling with more than 4 alternatives will probably get kind of messy. But luckily, because we never circle language our students already know, there will soon be parts of sentences you don't have to circle, which opens up colors to represent other elements of more complicated sentences. Try making up your own and circling them. There's no right or wrong way to divide up a sentence for circling. It depends on where your students are in their language acquisition and what you're concentrating on that day or even at that moment. Just make sure not to circle language they already know, or you will soon lose their attention and engagement.